Okay, today we're going to look at process mapping. This is a very valuable tool in the Lean Six Sigma toolbox that you'll find many organizations use. It's a great way to get a good understanding about, for a process, what is currently going on. And like the saying goes, a picture is worth 1,000 words. So you could try to describe a process in paragraph form with words, but often we find that it is just not as effective as seeing the process in some kind of process map. So again, the goal here is to document what the procedures are that are currently happening, and it's just as much easier for most people to understand that. They can understand a picture better than they can something like a standard operating procedure that's written in Word form. Just visually gives us a depiction of a process, and from the visual part of it, just by looking at the map, we get some kind of feel for how complex the process is that we're studying. It helps to identify waste and unnecessary complexity. That's the reason that so many organizations start with this when they're looking at trying to do process improvement. The type of process map that we're going to look at today helps us also understand how different departments or different people interact with one another during a process. There's a particular type of map that will make that more evident than some other types of map. It's a critical step towards achieving process improvement. There's very few process improvement techniques or tools that I would say are universal, that I would say are appropriate in almost every situation, but this is one of those tools or techniques that I would say is appropriate for almost every process improvement activity. You might be familiar with the type of a process map, and it's just a flow chart. Probably everyone's seen a flow chart. Maybe troubleshooting or something like that if you buy a piece of equipment. It's good for simple processes. It's good when there's only one person that's going to be doing all the steps. So if we look at this flow chart that's in front of us, it doesn't really indicate who's doing what. So if there's only one person doing all these steps, then this would make sense. Maybe a little bit more complicated type of flow chart is what we call a cross-functional process map, or some people call them swim lane maps. Here's an example of one where the lanes are actually vertical. A lot of times you'll see the lanes will be horizontal, so that's why I call them a swim lane map. And each lane, so in this example, each column represents a different department in an organization. We got, what does the customer do? What do the salespeople do? What does the warehouse do? What does customer service do? And this is a little bit more powerful than a typical flow chart because we see maybe there's two steps involved, and on a flow chart we would just see that there's two steps, but here we see there's two steps that maybe are being done by two different people or two different organizations or two different departments, and that's a lot of times where we have problems, is on those handoffs between one department and another. Sometimes that's where information gets dropped. Sometimes that's where time delays happen. So we really like to see where the workflow goes from one group, like the sales group sends an order to the warehouse for fulfillment, over to another group for the warehouse of actually shipping the item. Right here is where we find delays, and right here is where we find miscommunication when we go from one department to another. Some typical process map symbols, and we don't need to get too awfully sophisticated, but just a rectangular box for a process. If we have a decision to make, a lot of times we'll put those in a diamond. So here is an example. A lot of times in the decision is there's a question, is the item in stock? And if the item is yes, it's in stock, then kind of follow an arrow which tells us we're going to ship the item to the customer. If the item in stock, the answer to that is no, then we do something different. So a decision is this diamond shape. If you got a document that has to be referenced, you might draw a little kind of a rectangle, looks like a little piece of paper that's been ripped off at the bottom. This one, a predefined process, might mean a process within a process. So, depending on what level of detail we're studying, we might just put a whole process inside a symbol like this that means there's something else going on, and maybe we would go to another process map and further define that. And I'll show you an example of that here in just a minute. Maybe it'll make more sense. Just the workflow, an arrow that shows, where's work going from which step to which step. If we have storage, whether it's storage of paperwork or whether it's storage of actual material, this triangle, kind of an upside down triangle. And if there's specifically a step where we know there's a delay or we know there's some waiting, kind of this capital D looking symbol. So just a couple of simple symbols. A few hints for making your maps. Don't try to map every process. Select a typical process. So when you start process mapping, a lot of times people will say, if this happens, then we do this, and if that happens, then we do that, and if this goes on, we do something different. And rather than trying to map all those processes, let's just try to map the typical process. You always want to map with the team, because there are so many instances where there's no single person that understands everything that's going on. There's multiple people involved, multiple departments involved, and you need a group to get together to really go through the process from start to finish so that you have the expert for each step in that process. And we'd like to try to identify value-added steps and non-value-added steps. And we'll see here, what's a non-value-added step? Now, that's a step that the customer, if they knew that you were performing it, would not be willing to pay for that step. It's something that the customer doesn't value. And examples of non-value-added steps are things like waiting, and you might be waiting for people or waiting for papers or waiting for information. Any kind of movement that's going on is a non-value-added step. Rework is certainly a non-value-added step. This one might seem strange to you, but checking or inspecting is a non-value-added step. If we have processes that are set up correctly, then we don't really need to be doing checking and inspecting. We'll get good output when we perform a process that's a well-developed process. So that is a non-value-added step. Multiple signatures, a lot of people are familiar with those, certainly non-value-added step. Counting, kind of like checking and inspecting, those are non-value-added step. So again, this cross-functional or swim lane map we're going to look at, it's for multiple departments or multiple functions are involved. That can include functions outside of your particular organization. Sequence and time of operation is important, so we want to know what happens first, what happens second. We also like to know how long does it take to move from step 1 to step 2. Is that something that happens in a couple of minutes, or is that something that happens over a couple of days? It illustrates when information or materials are handed off from one department to another, and like we said, that's usually when there's delays and miscommunication. So here's one of these typical swim lane maps. Let's see what departments are involved. Looks like customer is involved. We got an engineering group that's involved. They're going to be any step that's on this row is being performed by the engineering group. There's a tooling group that's involved. They're doing a couple of steps. There's a production group involved. Looks like they're doing a few steps. There's a field service group involved for one step. So you can probably see from this map how it gives you more information than just a typical flow chart would, because when we go from one functional department to another, if we look here, we go from the production department to workflows back to the engineering group. It looks like, this is where we expect to find delays and miscommunication. Production does something with the project and they hand it off to engineering, and that's usually when trouble happens, is during these handoffs. It gives us some idea of how complex the process is because we see how many blocks or how many steps there are, and also just simply how many different functions are involved. So again, we're going to try to document and communicate our current process. We can use this to train employees about the current process rather than sitting someone down and having them read a manual. Again, we said a lot of times pictures worth 1,000 words. People can understand this process map better than they'll understand something in Word format. Identify areas of waste in current process. That's really the whole point of these process maps, is for process improvement. Identify areas for process improvement. And create a what-if future state process map. So we can draw on these process maps like it is today, and we can draw on these process maps how we envision it in the future. Here's a process map that we did that was related to procurement. That's like the purchasing process for, this was an actual company or an actual organization. Let's see how many different groups were involved. So there was the requester, that was the person who was needing something. There was a department manager, so that was the manager of the person who needed something. There was a buyer, There was the purchasing manager, there was the vendor who's going to supply the goods, and there was accounts payable. And we don't want to spend a whole lot of time on here, but just kind of get an idea of what was happening. The requester says, they need something, and they fill out a purchase requisition. Again, we've got this document shape, and then they hand that purchase requisition off to the department manager. The department manager performs some kind of approval, and then they hand it off to the buyer. The buyer asks themselves, do I have to have bids in order to buy this item? If the answer is yes, I have to have a bid, then here's one of these predefined processes. So that means invitation to bid process is a whole process in itself, and is going to be detailed somewhere else. And I'll show you that here in just a second. If the answer is no, there's not a bid required, then the buyer selects a vendor. Looks like then they hand this off to the vendor, and the vendor confirms price and delivery, and then they hand it back to the buyer, who creates a purchase order. And where do we go? From the purchase order down to the purchasing manager for an approval, and then back to the buyer to confirm the purchase order and notify the vendor, and then back to the vendor to fulfill the purchase order. That's to actually ship the item that was purchased. And our vendor is going to prepare an invoice, and let's see what happens. At the same time that the vendor is preparing an invoice, the requester receives the order. So the item's been shipped, the requester receives the order, so the requester prepares some kind of acknowledgement or receipt that the order was delivered. So we take that order receipt and send it to accounts payable, along with the invoice that goes to accounts payable, and accounts payable will perform this match of the invoice, the receiver, and the purchase order, and they'll authorize payment to the vendor. We said there was an invitation to bid process that was a predefined process up there, so somewhere else we have to go and make a map of what an invitation to bid process is, and that's what this is. Looks like 3 different groups, 3 different departments involved: a purchasing manager, a buyer, and the vendor themselves. And we just have outlined the steps that it takes for an invitation to bid. So this is a pretty simple technique. This was done in Visio as a software package. It's just about as easy to do them in Excel, because you already have rows and columns set up. You can use the Excel functions, draw functions to draw arrows, and make little boxes and triangles and diamonds. Very simple technique, easily done in Excel. Great visual tool to describe a process.